Ladies and gentlemen, today we delve into the dark and brutal world of organized crime, exploring the life and legacy of one of the most feared gangsters in American history, Roy DeMeo. A name synonymous with violence, loyalty, and the infamous murder machine, DeMeo was a key figure in the Gambino crime family, responsible for hundreds of brutal killings. His story is one of rise and fall, showcasing the bloody reality of the Mafia underworld. Roy DeMeo was one of the most violent and feared gangsters in the history of organized crime in America. Born on September 7, 1940, in Brooklyn, New York, DeMeo grew up in an Italian-American neighborhood where the influence of the Mafia was strong. From an early age, he was drawn to the criminal underworld, fascinated by the power and wealth that came with it. Unlike traditional Mafia figures who came from a background of smuggling or racketeering, DeMeo was known for his brutality and efficiency in killing, which made him an indispensable asset to the Gambino crime family. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he started his career as a loan shark, lending money at high interest rates and using extreme violence to ensure repayment. His ability to intimidate and enforce payments quickly caught the attention of the Mafia hierarchy, particularly Nino Gaggi, a powerful capo in the Gambino crime family. Under Gaggi's guidance, DeMeo became more deeply involved in organized crime, gradually shifting from small-time operations to high-level criminal activities. DeMeo's reputation was built on his ruthless nature and lack of hesitation in killing anyone who posed a threat. He had a simple rule: if there was a risk that someone might talk to law enforcement or betray the family, they had to be eliminated without hesitation. His willingness to kill, often without direct orders, set him apart from other mobsters. Unlike traditional Mafia hitmen who followed a strict code, DeMeo's killings were not just about business. They became a signature of his dominance and control. By the mid-1970s, DeMeo had formed his own crew of highly efficient killers, later infamously known as the Murder Machine. This group operated out of the Gemini Lounge, a bar in Brooklyn that became a slaughterhouse for their victims. DeMeo trained his crew in a systematic method of murder and body disposal to ensure that no evidence was left behind. This method involved luring the victim inside, shooting them in the head to render them unconscious, stabbing them in the heart to minimize bleeding, and then dismembering the body for disposal in garbage bags. His crew became one of the deadliest factions within the Gambino family, responsible for an estimated 100 to 200 murders over a decade. As his reputation grew, so did his wealth and power within the Mafia. He expanded his criminal operations, moving beyond contract killings into auto theft rings, drug trafficking, pornography distribution, and extortion. DeMeo's car theft operation was one of the most profitable in the U.S., stealing luxury cars and selling them overseas. Despite his increasing influence, his violent tendencies made him a major liability for the Gambino family. His frequent murders drew unwanted attention from law enforcement, leading the FBI to launch Operation Home Run, an investigation targeting DeMeo and his crew. Roy Albert DeMeo was born on September 7, 1940, in Brooklyn, New York, to a working-class Italian-American family. His parents were immigrants from Italy, who settled in New York in search of a better life, hoping to provide stability and opportunity for their children. DeMeo grew up in the Bensonhurst neighborhood, an area heavily influenced by the Mafia and organized crime. The values of loyalty, respect, and power shaped his mindset from a young age, and he quickly became familiar with a street culture that governed the lives of many Italian-American families at the time. Despite his later reputation as a ruthless gangster, DeMeo was an intelligent student in his early years. He attended James Madison High School and was known to be good with numbers, a skill that would later help him establish one of the largest loan sharking and extortion rackets in Brooklyn. However, despite his academic abilities, he was drawn to the glamour of the Mafia lifestyle he saw around him. Instead of pursuing a legitimate career, he found inspiration in the local gangsters who flaunted their wealth and power. By the time he was a teenager, DeMeo had already started engaging in small-scale criminal activities. He began working on the streets, running errands for local mobsters, and eventually got involved in loan sharking, lending money at extremely high interest rates to desperate individuals and using violence or intimidation to ensure they paid back their debts. Unlike traditional gangsters who slowly worked their way up in the mafia ranks, DeMeo was ambitious, aggressive, and willing to take extreme measures to establish himself as a feared enforcer. By his early 20s, DeMeo expanded his operations beyond loan sharking and got involved in car theft, an industry that proved to be highly lucrative. He organized a team of thieves who stole luxury cars, altered their identification numbers, and resold them for a massive profit. This enterprise not only increased his wealth, but also strengthened his connections with powerful figures in the Gambino crime family. His ability to generate money made him an attractive asset to the Mafia, which valued individuals who could bring in large amounts of cash. During this period, DeMeo also started working closely with Nino Gaggi, a capo, captain in the Gambino crime family. Gaggi recognized DeMeo's potential and took him under his wing, offering him protection and guidance in exchange for his criminal services. With Gaggi's backing, DeMeo's loan sharking and car theft operations grew exponentially, making him a well-known figure in the underworld. His rise was fueled not just by his business acumen but also by his growing reputation for ruthlessness and brutality. As DeMeo's influence expanded, he attracted a loyal crew of criminals, many of whom had little to no connection to traditional mafia families. Unlike the older generation of mobsters who adhered to a strict honor code, DeMeo and his associates operated with an extreme level of violence and efficiency, willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. His willingness to eliminate threats without hesitation made him a key figure in the Gambino family's enforcement operations. By the late 1960s, DeMeo had fully transitioned from a small-time loan shark and car thief to a respected and feared mafia associate. His ambition, intelligence, and brutality made him stand out, earning him a seat at the table with some of the most dangerous men in the Gambino crime family. However, as he climbed the ranks, his methods became increasingly violent, setting the stage for his eventual transformation into one of the most notorious killers in mafia history. Roy DeMeo's rapid ascent in the Gambino crime family was a direct result of his ruthlessness, intelligence, and ability to generate enormous profits for the organization. Unlike traditional mafia figures who often started as low-level foot soldiers and worked their way up over decades, DeMeo's financial skills and willingness to commit extreme acts of violence allowed him to rise at an accelerated pace. By the early 1970s, DeMeo had already established himself as a formidable figure in Brooklyn's criminal underworld. His successful loan sharking business, which involved lending money at exorbitant interest rates and using brutality to enforce payment, attracted the attention of higher-ranking mafia members. His most important connection was Nino Gaggi, a powerful capo, captain, in the Gambino family, who saw potential in DeMeo and took him under his wing. Gaggi recognized that DeMeo was not only capable of extreme violence, but was also a skilled businessman who could create lucrative opportunities for the family. With Gaggi's support, DeMeo expanded his criminal enterprises. While his loan sharking operation continued to thrive, he also built a highly sophisticated car theft ring, which became one of the most profitable rackets under his control. The auto theft operation involved stealing luxury cars, altering their vehicle identification numbers, VINs, and then selling them domestically and overseas. His crew was responsible for trafficking thousands of stolen vehicles, generating millions of dollars in revenue for the Gambino crime family. This money-making ability further solidified his status within the organization, as profitability was one of the most valued attributes in the mafia hierarchy. However, what truly distinguished DeMeo from other rising gangsters was his brutal enforcement tactics. He quickly became known as a man who would eliminate problems without hesitation, whether it was a business rival, a potential informant, or someone who simply owed him money. His efficiency in murder and body disposal earned him the trust of his superiors, particularly Paul Castellano, who had recently taken over as boss of the Gambino family. Castellano was not a traditional street boss who personally engaged in violence. Instead, he preferred to have enforcers like DeMeo handle the dirty work while he focused on the business side of the mafia. As DeMeo's reputation for violence grew, so did his inner circle of trusted associates. He handpicked a group of criminals who shared his brutal mindset and loyalty, forming what would later be known as the Murder Machine. This crew was responsible for some of the most gruesome and efficient contract killings in Mafia history. They specialized in eliminating targets with military precision, often luring victims to the Gemini Lounge, a Brooklyn bar that served as their execution site. There, they perfected the infamous Gemini Method, a systematic way of killing and disposing of bodies that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to gather evidence. DeMeo's success within the Gambino family continued throughout the late 1970s, as his crew carried out numerous hits ordered by the higher-ups, while also engaging in drug trafficking, pornography distribution, and extortion. Despite the Mafia's long-standing rule against drug dealing, DeMeo saw the potential for enormous profits and secretly facilitated narcotics operations without direct approval from Castellano. This decision would later create tension between DeMeo and the upper ranks of the Gambino family. While his status as a moneymaker and enforcer made him indispensable for a time, his increasing notoriety and reckless behavior started attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement. By the early 1980s, the FBI had begun investigating his activities, compiling evidence that connected him to dozens of unsolved murders. His rise in the Gambino family had made him powerful, but it had also made him a target, not just for the FBI, but for his own Mafia superiors, who began to see him as a dangerous liability point. One of the most terrifying aspects of Roy DeMeo's legacy in organized crime was his creation of the Murder Machine, a brutal, highly organized group of killers responsible for over 100 murders, possibly even as many as 200. This notorious death squad operated under DeMeo's leadership, carrying out assassinations with a level of precision, brutality, and secrecy that made them one of the most feared factions in the Gambino crime family. The Murder Machine was not a traditional Mafia hit squad. Instead of following the old-school code of honor, which dictated that killings were only carried out when absolutely necessary, DeMeo's crew killed frequently, indiscriminately, and often for profit. Many of their victims were not rival gangsters or informants, but business associates, debtors, and even close acquaintances who had outlived their usefulness or posed a potential threat. DeMeo had a simple rule: if in doubt, kill. He believed that taking a chance on someone's loyalty was too great a risk, and so paranoia fueled his ruthlessness. The Gemini Method, a systematic killing machine. One of DeMeo's most infamous innovations was the Gemini Method, a carefully designed execution technique that ensured no trace of a victim was ever found. Named after the Gemini Lounge, a bar in Brooklyn that served as his crew's headquarters, this method became one of the most gruesome and effective disposal tactics ever used in organized crime. The process typically followed a disturbingly efficient routine. Luring the victim, the target would be invited to the Gemini Lounge, believing they were there for a meeting, a favor, or business. DeMeo's crew would always keep the atmosphere friendly and casual, making sure the victim had no suspicion of what was about to happen. The execution. As soon as the victim stepped inside, a gunman, usually DeMeo or another trusted hitman, would fire a suppressed .22 caliber pistol shot to the head, instantly incapacitating them. The second strike. To minimize blood splatter, another crew member would immediately stab the victim in the heart. This ensured that the heart stopped pumping blood, preventing a mess and making cleanup easier. Stripping and cleaning the body. The corpse was stripped of all clothing, and the blood was drained to reduce decomposition odor. Dismemberment. Using butcher knives, saws, and industrial equipment, the body was systematically cut into smaller pieces. Disposal. The body parts were carefully wrapped in garbage bags, placed inside boxes, and discreetly dumped at landfills or other locations where they would never be found. This gruesome process allowed DeMeo's crew to eliminate dozens of enemies without leaving behind physical evidence. Many of the people who disappeared at the hands of the Murder Machine were never found, as their bodies were completely destroyed before police could investigate. DeMeo's crew, the key killers in the Murder Machine. The Murder Machine consisted of a tight-knit group of criminals who had been handpicked by DeMeo for their loyalty, cold-blooded nature, and ability to follow orders without question. Some of the key figures included Chris Rosenberg, One of DeMeo's most trusted hitmen, he was a trigger-happy killer who carried out numerous murders for the crew. Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, known as the Gemini twins, these two were responsible for dismembering victims and disposing of their bodies. Henry Borelli and Frederick Denome acted as enforcers, helping to coordinate hits and maintain the secrecy of the operation. Each member of DeMeo's crew was personally trained by him in the art of murder, body disposal, and secrecy. DeMeo instilled fear and discipline in his men, making sure they understood that disloyalty meant instant death. The fear factor. How DeMeo kept his reign intact. The brutal efficiency of the murder machine terrified even other mobsters. While the Mafia had always been involved in killings, most mobsters followed a code where murder was only used as a last resort. DeMeo, however, embraced killing as a way of doing business. His sheer willingness to murder, coupled with the methodical way he disposed of bodies, made him one of the most feared men in the Gambino crime family. Law enforcement officials and Mafia associates alike were shocked by the level of violence DeMeo used to maintain power. Even hardened criminals knew that crossing paths with him meant certain death, and his reputation as a ruthless enforcer only grew stronger over time. However, this same brutality that had made him indispensable to the Gambino family would eventually lead to his downfall. While Roy DeMeo was infamous for his violent reputation and involvement in the murder machine, what made him truly valuable to the Gambino crime family was his ability to generate enormous amounts of money through various criminal enterprises. DeMeo was not just a ruthless killer, he was also a highly skilled businessman who knew how to exploit illegal ventures for maximum profit. Over the years, he built an empire that included loan sharking, auto theft, drug trafficking, extortion, and even the pornography industry. His financial success allowed him to rise quickly within the Gambino family, as he consistently delivered millions of dollars in profits to the organization. 1. Loan sharking, the foundation of DeMeo's wealth. One of DeMeo's earliest and most lucrative ventures was loan sharking, the practice of lending money at extremely high interest rates and using threats or violence to enforce repayment. This business played a crucial role in establishing his power in the criminal underworld. DeMeo's loan sharking operation started small, but as he gained influence within the Gambino family, he expanded his network of borrowers. He lent money to business owners, gamblers, and small-time criminals, all of whom had no other choice but to accept his high interest rates, sometimes reaching hundreds of % annually. If a debtor failed to pay, DeMeo had no hesitation in using violence, beatings, threats, and even murder to make an example of those who refused to comply. Many borrowers knew that defaulting on a loan from DeMeo meant certain death, which ensured a steady flow of fear-driven payments. This loan sharking empire made DeMeo millions of dollars over time and allowed him to reinvest in other illegal enterprises. 2. The auto theft empire, a global black market operation. One of DeMeo's most innovative and profitable criminal enterprises was a massive auto theft ring that operated on a national and international level. In the 1970s and early 1980s, DeMeo and his crew specialized in stealing luxury cars, altering their identification numbers, and selling them in foreign markets such as South America, the Middle East, and Europe. The operation became so sophisticated and well-organized that it was one of the largest car theft rings in New York City at the time. DeMeo partnered with corrupt mechanics, DMV employees, and overseas buyers to make the operation run smoothly. The stolen cars were often given new VIN numbers and fake registration documents, making them nearly impossible to trace. This racket generated millions of dollars for DeMeo and his crew. However, the scale of the operation also attracted the attention of law enforcement, which began investigating the massive wave of stolen vehicles flooding the market. 3. Drug trafficking, a risky but profitable business. Although the Mafia had strict rules against drug dealing, DeMeo saw the massive profit potential in narcotics and secretly engaged in drug distribution despite the risks. DeMeo worked with drug dealers, street gangs, and corrupt law enforcement officials to traffic cocaine, heroin, and marijuana throughout New York. While he never became a major drug kingpin, his drug operation added another stream of income to his already profitable empire. His involvement in narcotics violated the rules of the Gambino family, as the boss, Paul Castellano, strongly opposed drug dealing. This later became a major source of tension between DeMeo and the Mafia leadership. 4. The pornography and sex industry racket. Another area where DeMeo made significant money was through his involvement in the pornography industry. In the 1970s, the adult film industry was highly profitable but largely unregulated, making it a prime target for organized crime. DeMeo controlled several illegal pornography operations, including X-rated film distribution, peep shows, and sex shops. He also extorted legitimate adult film producers, forcing them to pay protection money to avoid violent repercussions. Some of the underground adult films he distributed included illegal material, such as those featuring underage performers, which later brought unwanted law enforcement attention. While this racket was incredibly profitable, it further exposed DeMeo's criminal empire to FBI investigations. 5. Extortion and protection rackets, controlling businesses through fear. Like many mafia figures, DeMeo ran an extensive extortion network, forcing businesses to pay protection money under threat of violence. He targeted bars, restaurants, construction companies, and small businesses, all of which were forced to pay monthly fees to avoid destruction or harm. His crew would often smash windows, vandalize stores, or threaten employees as a warning to those who refused to comply. Once a business was under his protection, DeMeo ensured that no other criminals or rival gangs could touch it, solidifying his reputation as a powerful enforcer. 6. Contract killings. Murder for hire. One of DeMeo's most feared income sources was murder for hire. The murder machine carried out assassinations not just for the Gambino family, but also for other criminal organizations, drug lords, and corrupt businessmen. Each hit was meticulously planned and executed with absolute precision, using the infamous Gemini Method to ensure no trace of the body was left behind. DeMeo was personally responsible for dozens of murders, but his crew as a whole carried out over 100 contract killings. This reputation for efficient and brutal executions made DeMeo one of the most feared enforcers in Mafia history, but it also made him a huge liability. The downside of DeMeo's criminal success. While DeMeo's numerous illegal enterprises made him one of the most financially successful figures in the Gambino crime family, they also drew increasing attention from law enforcement. The FBI and NYPD began investigating his auto theft operation, linking it to hundreds of stolen cars. His loan sharking and extortion businesses left behind a trail of victims who feared but secretly despised him. His involvement in drug trafficking and pornography violated Mafia rules, making him an internal liability to the Gambino leadership. As his crew continued murdering at an alarming rate, federal authorities gathered evidence, linking him to numerous unsolved homicides. As Roy DeMeo's criminal empire grew, so did the attention of law enforcement. The FBI, NYPD, and other federal agencies began investigating his activities in the late 1970s and early 1980s, as his involvement in auto theft, loan sharking, drug trafficking, extortion, and murder became impossible to ignore. While DeMeo had been careful to cover his tracks for years, the sheer scale of his criminal operations eventually drew the eyes of federal authorities, leading to a series of increasingly aggressive investigations. The auto theft investigation, cracking a massive car theft ring. One of the first major law enforcement operations targeting DeMeo centered around his highly sophisticated auto theft ring. In the late 1970s, law enforcement agencies in New York, New Jersey, and Florida began noticing an alarming increase in the number of high-end luxury vehicles disappearing. Many of these stolen cars were never recovered, while others resurfaced in foreign markets with altered identification numbers. The FBI launched Operation Sunroof, an undercover initiative aimed at uncovering the inner workings of New York's largest auto theft syndicates. Investigators soon found that the most well-organized and profitable car theft operation was being run by none other than Roy DeMeo and his crew. By 1979, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to link DeMeo's network to hundreds of stolen vehicles, prompting a full-scale investigation. This growing law enforcement pressure forced DeMeo to become even more secretive about his operations. However, despite his efforts, investigators continued building a case against him. Murder investigations, the first breaks in the case. For years, DeMeo's murder machine had functioned with absolute secrecy, disposing of bodies so efficiently that law enforcement had little to no evidence to pursue. However, as the FBI intensified its focus on organized crime and unsolved homicides, they began linking several high-profile disappearances to DeMeo's crew. One of the first key breaks in the murder investigation came when authorities began suspecting that many of New York's missing persons cases were actually linked to DeMeo and his crew. By analyzing the patterns of disappearances, investigators realized that dozens of suspected mafia-related killings followed a distinctive modus operandi. Detectives working on cold cases started noticing a recurring pattern. Several people who had last been seen alive at or near the Gemini Lounge had vanished without a trace. As more informants and ex-criminals came forward with whispers of DeMeo's brutality, law enforcement increased their focus on him. At this stage, the FBI still lacked solid physical evidence, as DeMeo's body disposal methods had been remarkably effective. However, investigators were beginning to connect the dots, which greatly alarmed the Gambino leadership. Surveillance and wiretaps, watching DeMeo's every move. As the FBI deepened its investigations into organized crime, it started employing more sophisticated surveillance tactics, including wiretaps, informants, and undercover operatives. The FBI placed wiretaps on suspected associates of DeMeo, hoping to catch him discussing his criminal operations. Undercover officers infiltrated New York's auto theft networks, attempting to trace stolen cars back to their sources. The NYPD's Organized Crime Bureau worked alongside federal agents to track DeMeo's movements, finances, and business dealings. Investigators closely monitored the Gemini Lounge, observing who came in and out and tracking suspected mafia members meeting with DeMeo. While DeMeo remained highly cautious, his constant involvement in illegal activities made it nearly impossible for him to completely evade detection. The first informants, breaking the code of silence. The Mafia's traditional strength had always been its code of silence, omerta, which discouraged members from cooperating with law enforcement. However, as the FBI intensified pressure on DeMeo's crew, cracks began to appear in his operation. In 1980, the first major informant linked to DeMeo's crew began providing information to authorities. While this informant did not have first-hand knowledge of the Gemini Lounge murders, they revealed crucial details about DeMeo's loan sharking, extortion, and auto theft operations. The FBI now had insider testimony that confirmed what they had long suspected. DeMeo was running a massive criminal empire that spanned multiple illegal enterprises. More importantly, they realized that DeMeo was becoming increasingly paranoid, a sign that he knew the law was closing in on him. As more criminal associates faced arrest, some began flipping to avoid harsh prison sentences. These early informants set the stage for what would eventually become a much larger investigation into DeMeo's murders. FBI's ultimate target, linking DeMeo to Paul Castellano. By the early 1980s, it became clear that the FBI was not just going after Roy DeMeo, they were targeting the entire Gambino crime family. Law enforcement agencies had long suspected that the Mafia's leadership was connected to DeMeo's operations, but they needed hard evidence to prove it. By linking DeMeo's criminal activities to higher-ranking Gambino figures, federal agents hoped to bring down major Mafia leaders, including Paul Castellano. The FBI launched a racketeering case, using a strategy similar to what had worked against other crime families, tying murders, loan sharking, and illegal business operations to the leadership. DeMeo's increasing recklessness and violence became a major concern for Castellano, who worried that DeMeo was attracting too much law enforcement attention. The Gambino family began distancing itself from DeMeo, realizing that his paranoia, growing FBI surveillance, and out-of-control criminal operations were too dangerous to keep around. The FBI's pressure, the beginning of DeMeo's downfall. As law enforcement intensified its investigation, DeMeo became paranoid and unstable. He increased his personal security, suspecting that even his closest allies might turn against him. He stopped frequenting certain locations, fearing that the FBI had informants watching him. The more law enforcement pressure increased, the more nervous the Gambino leadership became, eventually leading them to make a fateful decision about DeMeo's fate. Despite his efforts to evade justice, The combined pressure from federal agents, increasing informant testimonies, and internal mafia distrust ensured that Roy DeMeo's days were numbered. Roy DeMeo had spent years rising through the ranks of the Gambino crime family, building an empire that was both highly profitable and extremely violent. His ability to generate enormous wealth through loan sharking, auto theft, extortion, and murder made him a valuable asset to the organization. However, by the early 1980s, DeMeo's relationship with the Gambino leadership, particularly boss Paul Castellano, began to deteriorate rapidly. His downfall was not the result of a single event but rather a combination of factors, including his reckless criminal activities, increasing law enforcement pressure, and internal conflicts within the mafia. As DeMeo became more paranoid and unpredictable, Castellano and other high-ranking Gambino leaders began to see him as a liability rather than an asset. 1. DeMeo's growing law enforcement attention, a threat to the mafia. By the early 1980s, DeMeo was under intense scrutiny from the FBI, NYPD, and federal prosecutors. His criminal operations had become too large and too notorious to remain hidden. The FBI had launched a full-scale investigation into DeMeo's auto theft ring, linking him to hundreds of stolen luxury vehicles that had been shipped overseas. His loan sharking and extortion rackets had left behind a trail of intimidated victims, some of whom were cooperating with law enforcement. Several members of DeMeo's crew had already begun flipping to avoid long prison sentences, providing damaging information about his illegal activities. The FBI also suspected DeMeo of being responsible for dozens of murders, though they lacked direct physical evidence at the time. As the investigations escalated, it became clear to Paul Castellano and the Gambino leadership that DeMeo was attracting too much heat. 2. Paul Castellano's disapproval, a dangerous rift. Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, was known for being a businessman first and a gangster second. Unlike his predecessors, Castellano preferred to focus on white-collar crimes, such as construction fraud, union corruption, and stock market manipulation, operations that were highly profitable and attracted less law enforcement attention. DeMeo, on the other hand, represented the opposite of Castellano's vision for the Gambino family. DeMeo's excessive violence, high-profile murders, and illegal businesses such as drug trafficking and pornography violated Castellano's strict rules. The FBI was building a racketeering case against the Gambino family, and DeMeo's involvement in drug dealing and mass murders made him a prime target. Castellano had already distanced himself from other Gambino members who had drawn too much attention, including the infamous John Gotti, who was also involved in drug trafficking. He worried that DeMeo's reckless behavior would jeopardize the entire Gambino family by bringing down federal indictments. Despite DeMeo's ability to generate millions of dollars, Castellano began to see him as more of a risk than an asset. 3. The internal mafia power struggles. DeMeo's enemies grow. Aside from his problems with Castellano, DeMeo had made numerous enemies within the Gambino family and other mafia factions. His ruthless reputation made even fellow gangsters afraid of him. Many worried that if DeMeo saw them as a threat, they would end up dead. Some Gambino members resented his power and influence, believing that he had too much independence within the organization. DeMeo's crew had been responsible for over 100 murders, and there were growing concerns that his men would turn informant if arrested. His reckless decision to engage in drug trafficking had violated the mafia's traditional rules, further alienating him from the Gambino leadership. By 1982, DeMeo was isolated within his own organization. He still held power, but he had lost the trust of his bosses. 4. DeMeo's growing paranoia, signs of an inevitable fall. As law enforcement pressure intensified and his enemies within the mafia multiplied, DeMeo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped trusting even his closest allies, believing that anyone could be an informant. He became obsessed with security, frequently changing his routines and carrying multiple firearms. He ordered the murders of several close associates whom he suspected of being informants, even if there was no concrete evidence against them. He isolated himself, rarely appearing in public and avoiding mafia meetings for fear that he was being targeted. This paranoia only confirmed Castellano's suspicions that DeMeo was spiraling out of control and could not be trusted. 5. The Mafia's final decision, cutting ties with DeMeo. By the end of 1982, Paul Castellano and the Gambino leadership had made up their minds. Roy DeMeo had become too dangerous to keep alive. He was facing imminent indictment, and if arrested, he could turn informant to avoid life in prison. His reckless criminal activities and endless string of murders had made him a major liability. Several of his own crew members had begun cooperating with the FBI, and it was only a matter of time before law enforcement gathered enough evidence to convict him. Most importantly, Castellano did not want to risk having the entire Gambino family brought down because of DeMeo's mistakes. By early 1983, Roy DeMeo had become a man marked for death. Once a powerful and feared enforcer for the Gambino crime family, he was now seen as a dangerous liability. His reckless criminal empire, his growing law enforcement scrutiny, and his increasing paranoia had made him too much of a risk for his mafia bosses, particularly Paul Castellano. DeMeo had always been the executioner, leading his crew in over 100 brutal murders. But now he was the one being hunted. As rumors swirled within the mafia that his time was up, DeMeo began sensing the inevitable, yet he still refused to go down without a fight. 1. DeMeo's last days, a man living in fear. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance and murder, DeMeo's paranoia reached extreme levels. He had become erratic and distrustful, carrying multiple firearms and constantly looking over his shoulder. He stopped attending regular Gambino family meetings, fearing that he would be ambushed and killed. He increased his security measures, switching cars frequently and changing his routine to avoid being an easy target. He even considered going into hiding, but his loyalty to the Mafia code kept him from running. Despite his fears, DeMeo continued conducting business, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. However, he knew that the Mafia had a strict rule. When a hit was sanctioned, there was no escape. 2. The night of the hit, DeMeo walks into a trap. On January 10, 1983, Roy DeMeo was last seen alive as he left his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He told his family that he had to attend a business meeting, but in reality, he was going to meet his fellow Gambino associates, the same men who had likely been ordered to kill him. DeMeo entered a location, possibly a Mafia-connected club or warehouse, expecting a routine discussion. However, once inside, he was ambushed by multiple gunmen, shot multiple times in the head and body. His killers then left his body inside the trunk of his own Cadillac, abandoning the vehicle in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. 3. The discovery of his body. A shocking end. 6 days after his disappearance, on January 16, 1983, DeMeo's car was found parked near the Sheepshead Bay area of Brooklyn. The trunk of his Cadillac was pried open, and inside was his decomposing body, riddled with gunshot wounds. His body was so bloated from decay that investigators initially had difficulty identifying him. He had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, including a fatal shot to the head, the signature of a Mafia-style execution. It was clear that DeMeo had been set up by people he trusted, an ironic fate for a man who had spent his life betraying and executing others. 4. Who ordered the hit? Theories and suspects. The official motive behind DeMeo's murder was clear. Paul Castellano wanted him dead to eliminate a dangerous liability. However, there has always been mystery surrounding exactly who pulled the trigger. Some believe that the order came directly from Castellano, who had grown increasingly frustrated with DeMeo's recklessness and feared he would flip under FBI pressure. One theory suggests that DeMeo's own crew, the men who had worked under him for years, were forced to carry out the hit to prove their loyalty to the Gambino family. Others speculate that Nino Gaggi, DeMeo's longtime mentor, was involved in luring him into the trap before handing him over to the hitmen. There were even whispers that John Gotti, who would later become Gambino boss, may have had a role in setting up DeMeo to eliminate a potential rival. Regardless of who pulled the trigger, the message was clear. Roy DeMeo had outlived his usefulness, and in the Mafia, that meant death. The murder of Roy DeMeo in January 1983 sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Once a feared and untouchable enforcer of the Gambino crime family, he had met the same fate that he had inflicted upon countless others, ambushed and executed by his own associates. However, while his death silenced him, it did not end the scrutiny surrounding his crimes. In fact, his murder only intensified law enforcement's crackdown on the DeMeo Crew and their grisly trail of bloodshed. With their leader gone, the DeMeo Crew crumbled under pressure as investigators zeroed in on his remaining associates. The same men who had once proudly carried out DeMeo's brutal orders now turned against each other, as the government built its strongest case yet against the Gambino family. 1. The DeMeo Crew's desperation, a criminal empire without a leader. For years, Roy DeMeo had been the backbone of his gang, a ruthless leader who demanded loyalty and obedience. His murder left a massive power vacuum within the DeMeo Crew, and without his iron grip, the group quickly fell apart. Many of his most loyal killers were now on their own, unsure of what would happen next. They lost the protection they once had under the Gambino crime family, as Paul Castellano had officially cut all ties with DeMeo's operations. Fear and paranoia spread rapidly among the remaining members, as they realized that without DeMeo, they were now exposed to law enforcement. Some attempted to keep the auto theft and loan sharking operations running, but without DeMeo's leadership, the crew was no longer as powerful or efficient. With no one left to protect them, and with FBI agents closing in, members of the DeMeo Crew began to turn on each other in a desperate attempt to survive. 2. The FBI's breakthrough. Witnesses start talking. Before his death, Roy DeMeo had avoided law enforcement by maintaining fear and absolute loyalty among his men. However, once he was gone, the walls of silence began to crack. Several low-ranking members of his crew who had been arrested for various crimes saw an opportunity to save themselves. The FBI, now more determined than ever, offered deals to those willing to provide inside information on DeMeo's criminal empire. The biggest blow came when Dominic Montilio, the nephew of DeMeo's mentor Nino Gaggi, agreed to testify against the Gambino crime family. Soon, other members of the DeMeo Crew began cooperating, revealing chilling details about their boss's infamous murder factory and the dozens of bodies left in his wake. As more witnesses came forward, the FBI finally had the evidence they needed to bring down the most feared hit squad in New York's underworld. 3. The Gambino family's efforts to distance itself. After DeMeo's death, the Gambino leadership, particularly Paul Castellano, made every effort to distance themselves from his crimes. Castellano denied any connection to the DeMeo Crew's violent activities, portraying himself as a legitimate businessman rather than a gangster. The Mafia attempted to erase DeMeo's existence, pretending that his operation had nothing to do with the Gambino crime family. However, law enforcement was not convinced and continued to connect DeMeo's activities directly to the Gambino family's larger criminal network. Even though DeMeo was gone, the Mafia's worst nightmare had come true. His former associates were now cooperating with authorities, leading to dozens of arrests and convictions. Despite the Mafia's attempts to downplay their connection, the DeMeo Crew's crimes had become too big to ignore, and the government was determined to hold the Gambinos accountable. 4. Indictments, trials, and the end of the DeMeo Crew. As the government built its case, the DeMeo Crew's surviving members were rounded up and charged with a long list of violent crimes. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, two of DeMeo's most trusted killers, were arrested and convicted of multiple murders. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dominic Montilio's testimony helped prosecutors convict Nino Gaggi, DeMeo's longtime mentor, who was sentenced to 40 years in prison before dying behind bars. Dozens of other Gambino associates, including low-level enforcers and business partners, were either convicted or forced into hiding. The trials revealed shocking details about DeMeo's murderous reign, including the full extent of the Gemini Method, his infamous system for disposing of bodies. With the DeMeo Crew completely dismantled, one of the most feared and violent factions of the Mafia was finally brought to justice. However, even with these convictions, the full scope of their crimes remains a chilling mystery, as many of DeMeo's victims were never found or identified. Even decades after his death, Roy DeMeo's name still strikes fear in the world of organized crime. He was not just another Mafia enforcer, he was one of the most brutal and effective killers in Mafia history. His reign of terror, marked by hundreds of murders, the creation of the infamous Gemini Method, and his ruthless leadership of the DeMeo Crew, has cemented him as one of the most notorious figures in organized crime. But his impact didn't just fade after his murder. His legacy continued to shape the Mafia, law enforcement strategies, and even pop culture for years to come. 1. The Gemini Method, a blueprint for brutal efficiency. Perhaps DeMeo's most terrifying contribution to the world of organized crime was his method of murder and body disposal, now known as the Gemini Method. Unlike typical mafia killings, which often involved simple shootings or stabbings, DeMeo developed an assembly line process for murder, ensuring no bodies were ever found. Victims were lured into the back room of the Gemini Lounge, where they were shot in the head, immediately stabbed in the heart to stop blood flow, and then hung upside down in a bathtub. The bodies were dismembered piece by piece, packed into garbage bags, and thrown away with regular city trash, leaving no trace of their existence. This method was so effective and terrifying that it became a mafia legend, with other criminal groups adopting similar disposal techniques to evade law enforcement. Even today, the Gemini Method is studied by criminologists as it represents one of the most extreme examples of organized crime brutality. 2. The psychological terror of Roy DeMeo. Unlike many mobsters who sought to keep a low profile, DeMeo thrived on fear. He was known for his cold, remorseless personality, able to kill without hesitation, even people he had known for years. His reputation was so fearsome that even fellow mafia members avoided crossing him, knowing that a simple disagreement could mean death. Many criminals who heard about DeMeo chose to flee or cooperate with the FBI, fearing that if they stayed in the underworld, they could become his next victim. Even among the most hardened killers in the Mafia, DeMeo's level of violence stood out, making him both a valuable asset and a dangerous liability to the Gambino family. His reign of terror created a culture of paranoia, where even the most ruthless criminals feared the consequences of falling into his hands. 3. The fallout within the Gambino crime family. Roy DeMeo's actions had long-term consequences for the Mafia, particularly the Gambino crime family. His murder was one of the first signs that Paul Castellano was losing control, as DeMeo's unchecked violence had brought too much attention to the Gambinos. The FBI's investigation into DeMeo led to major indictments against the Gambino family, weakening their power in the 1980s. The internal divisions created by DeMeo's murder would later contribute to John Gotti's rise to power, as Castellano was eventually seen as a weak leader who had lost control of his men. DeMeo's former operations, including his auto theft empire and loan sharking business, were either dismantled by law enforcement or taken over by rival factions. His influence was so strong that even after his death, the shockwaves from his actions were felt for years, reshaping the power structure within the Mafia. 4. Roy DeMeo in pop culture and crime history. Despite his gruesome crimes, Roy DeMeo has become a legendary figure in true crime history, influencing books, documentaries, and movies. The book Murder Machine by Gene Mustain and Jerry Capeci is one of the most detailed accounts of DeMeo's violent career, providing an in-depth look into his crimes, methods, and eventual downfall. His story has been referenced in numerous mafia documentaries, showcasing his infamous brutality and impact on the underworld. Some elements of DeMeo's life and crew have influenced Hollywood portrayals of mobsters, with characters in movies like Goodfellas and The Sopranos taking inspiration from his ruthless persona. His murder remains one of the most talked about mafia assassinations, as it was a rare case where a top enforcer was killed by his own family out of fear. Even today, discussions about organized crime almost always include Roy DeMeo's name, as he remains one of the most feared hitmen in mafia history.